Welcome to this presentation setting out why we should value our peatland treasures. My name's Clifton Bain. I'm based here in my home city of Edinburgh, and I've been working in nature conservation for over 35 years, mainly with the RSPB and currently with the IUCN UK Peatland programme, which is a partnership of policy, science and practice, all aimed at conserving and restoring our peatlands. It's fair to say that when thinking of our greatest natural treasures, for most people that doesn't have peatlands in it. Often they're termed the Cinderella habitat, underappreciated, abused, and in literature and popular media, peatlands don't exactly get a good press. They're derided as treacherous, smelly, stinking places, dangerous, or at best dull, boring and worthless. And for centuries they've been seen as land to be turned into something else, or areas to be exploited, providing fuel, peat for fuel, or in most people's experiences, compost for gardening. But we're now at something of a turning point for peatlands, with global recognition of their importance, particularly in light of the climate change and biodiversity challenges facing us. The recent COP26 event in Glasgow had peatlands showcased as a key solution to these intimately connected crises. World leaders agreed that damage to our natural environment has been the cause of our problems, and that nature-based solutions with habitat protection and restoration can help us get out of this mess, with peatlands being a prime example. I recently completed a journey around the peatlands of Britain and Ireland. I travelled around them using public transport, my bike and walking, and aimed at capturing the peatland conservation story, but I also wanted to highlight the incredible work underway to repair our damaged peatlands, but most of all to demonstrate that peatlands offer some of the best and most fascinating nature experiences and best days out that these islands have to offer. Peatlands are wetlands where vegetation is adapted to thrive in the saturated environment. The waterlogged anaerobic conditions limit the decay of dead plant material, which then builds up as peat. And since the end of the last ice age over 10,000 years ago, the peat has been accumulating slowly at about 1 millimetre a year. And now some peatlands are holding peat deposits over 12 metres deep. In Britain and Ireland we have two main types of peatland. The first is the bogs, split into the extensive blanket bogs which cover the hills and mountains in a sort of mantle over the landscape. And then we have also within the bogs, the rarer lowland raised bog, which is an isolated dome of peat in the landscape. These were once abundant, but now occupy less than 5% of their original area. And both types of bog are largely composed of sphagnum mosses, which obtain all their water from direct precipitation in rainfall and clouds. They're not in contact with the groundwater. And the sphagnum is an amazing plant. It has different species ranging from reds, golds, greens, and its cell structure allows it to store 20 times its dry weight of water. And if you wring out a clump of sphagnum moss, you'll see just how much water it can hold. A peat bog is over 90% water and contains fewer solid than milk, yet we're able to walk on its surface because of the supporting lattice of the sphagnum plants. The sphagnum also creates an acidic environment, and its cells contain phenolic compounds which limit decay. And these absorptive and sterile properties of sphagnum led to it being harvested in great quantities during the First World War as a wound dressing for the soldiers. These low nutrient acidic environments of bogs also hold fascinating insectivorous plants like sundews, who in the lack of nutrients have had to turn to eating insects. And the sundews have these amazing red fleshy leaves tipped by little sticky dewdrop tentacles that trap the insects, and then the leaf curls in and digests their bodies to provide the nutrients. The open expanse of a bog is also a fantastic place and safe place for roosting geese and wintering birds of prey, and they're also breeding grounds for some of our rarest and most threatened wading birds, such as golden plover and dunlin, who occur in fantastic numbers, particularly on the northern bogs of Scotland. So the second type of peatland is the fen, and these form in areas of water such as shallow depressions in the landscape or in seepage zones in the hillsides. And extensive fens once occupied much of the low-lying land of England and eastern England and southern England, but today just exist as fragments in an agricultural landscape. Perhaps the biggest and most famous of the riverine fens in a big floodplain of the River Spey is Inch Marshes. It's one of the largest surviving riverine fens in the whole of Europe, and it plays a key role in storing floodwater and protecting the downstream villages. You also get fens in numerous small features, sometimes even within the blanket bogs, but very small and very much reduced compared to their previous distribution. In fact, a clue to the more widespread distribution of fens can be found if you look at the Old English word for the crane, a bird that has been absent in Britain now for over 400 years and is slowly returning to some fen sites. But if you look at a map for the Old English word crane, which is cran, as in cranfield, or the Old Norse word tran, as in Tranmere, you'll see numerous examples of places where these birds were obviously present at the times that the places were named. Because fens are in contact with the mineral soil, unlike the bogs, they have more nutrients available, and so they support a different range of plants, particularly sedges, reeds and rushes, and they're incredibly rich in invertebrates, which provides food for a wide array of birds, particularly the warblers, really noisy birds whose loud calls can penetrate the lush, reedy vegetation. One of the most spectacular features of peatlands is as an archive. Waterlogged, anaerobic conditions beautifully preserve organic materials, which is something you don't get so much in the drier soils. So wood, plant matter, textiles, even flesh and hair are all preserved for thousands of years. And that gives us a really clear picture of past environments, as well as people's cultures and daily lives. Probably the most dramatic of the archaeological finds are the preserved bog bodies, as they're often called, mostly people from around 2,000 years ago during the Iron Age. And this incredible preservation of their bodies, sometimes mistaken as recent murder victims, they show that these were often brutal, ritualized deaths associated with some form of sacrifice. And along with the bodies, there are often valuable items, including precious metals, food offerings, barrels of butter, all suggesting that these bogs were regarded as sacred places. We also have preserved in the bogs ancient trackways, and some of them were clearly there to allow people to access the peatland, to get access for hunting and fishing. But many of the trackways seem to just go into the bog and stop, and it's thought that these were constructed to enable these gruesome ceremonies, and some of them perhaps just as a show of strength or territorial marking to other neighbouring clans. One classic example is at the Corley Trackway in Ireland, which was constructed about 2,100 years ago, and it's a huge 3-metre wide trackway, and it involved the felling of over 300 large oak trees to make the planks, so it was a substantial structure. Sadly, within 10 years of being on the bog, it sunk into the peat to be preserved and then discovered only a few decades ago as a result of peat cutters opening up the bog. The peat itself has long been valued as a resource, as a fuel for burning. The practice of Celtic tribes burning earth, as the Romans recorded, was still widespread in Britain and Ireland up until recent 200 years ago. And when I say widespread, huge amounts of peat were being cut to provide fuel for the big cities, such as York or Carlisle. And we've got records of tons and tons of peat being used to heat the big cathedrals of Norwich and Strata Florida in Wales. And these were major operations requiring drainage of huge areas of peatland at the time. It then dwindled, and you now get peat burning for fuel in isolated areas of Ireland and northern Scotland, but largely it's died out. And apart from the industrial extraction of peat from the Midlands of Ireland, which in the 20th century was still being extracted to power electricity generating stations, but that's now stopped. Perhaps the most widespread, even more than the burning of fuel peat, is the agricultural changes that went on, particularly with modern agricultural improvement from the mid-17th century onwards. We had the famous Dutch engineer Vermuyden overseeing the drainage of Hatfield Chase in Lincolnshire in the 1630s, and then later in the huge Cambridgeshire fens, all aided by the enforced work of thousands of Scottish prisoners who'd been captured in the Civil War by Cromwell's soldiers, a story that's not often told about the horrendous fate for these poor people having to dig up the drains in these vast fen peatlands. The people that were living there weren't happy with these changes going on. The big agriculture investors had to overcome severe opposition, but they won their day in court, and the agricultural investment continued. I would say they were only partially successful, however, as the drainage work caused the peatlands to subside and the land flooded, making it relatively useless for agriculture. A dramatic example of this subsidence can be seen at Home Fen, one of the small remnants of the Cambridgeshire fens. A post was pushed down through the peat to the underlying mineral layer in the 19th century, and 170 years later, 4 metres of that post have now been exposed as the peat has subsided, and the site itself, Home Fen, now lies below sea level as a result of all the drainage work that has gone on in the area. The later agriculture reformers of the 18th and 19th centuries considered peatlands to be worthless in their natural state, and they were something to be improved, inevitably through drainage to support vegetation that preferred drier conditions, so grasses for livestock grazing in the uplands, or arable crops in the lowlands. You often hear of East Anglia as the breadbasket of England, and is providing vegetables and salad crops for the whole nation. In Flanders Moss in Stirlingshire, agricultural improvement in the 19th century went so far as to remove thousands and thousands of tons of peat from the lowland raised bogs there to get to the richer alluvial soils below. The peat was washed down drains into the River Forth, much to the dismay of the local fishing community and the harbour authorities there, who complained at the huge quantities of silt, the peat. At Thornmoors in the northeast of England, the huge areas of peatland were warped, which involved creating fertile agricultural land by river engineering projects that flooded the land and deposited up to a metre of silt, the warp, onto the peatland, and this covered huge areas around the Humberhead levels. So around this time, in these agricultural improvement era, some of our major peatlands literally vanished from the map, with not a layer of peat left. And the peatlands, having once covered a third of Britain, now you only find about 10% of our country has peatlands with any form of peatland vegetation on it. After the Second World War, nature conservation legislation came in that recognised peatlands as priorities for conservation. They were largely valued for their ecological interest, but peatlands continued to be damaged. Right up until the 1980s, government was providing grants to farmers to drain the peatlands, subsidies to maintain high levels of sheep grazing and arable crops, and there were subsidies and tax benefits for people putting trees onto peatlands, the commercial forestry planting. Built development, including rubbish tips, housing, wind farms, and even spaceports, are still being targeted at peatlands because the land is seen as relatively cheap and out of the way. Since the 1950s, the horticulture industry has intensified commercial peat extraction to provide a low-price growing media for gardeners. And across much of our uplands, burning of heather as part of grouse moor management or livestock management, or as accidental fires, has been damaging peatland ecosystems and is putting at risk efforts to restore the peatlands. The results of all these forms of activity means that over 80% of our remaining UK peatlands are ecologically degraded, and they're not fully functioning as peatlands, and I'll get on to what that means for us. So the 20th century saw a new dawn for peatlands. We understand much better the true value of our peatlands and the costly consequences of our peatland legacy. In the bogs, the harsh environment has meant that sheep and forest land uses are no longer as economically competitive, and they're not the great promise of draining the peatlands to provide profit hasn't arisen. On top of that, the bogs are eroding with huge drainage channels widening and deepening into the peat, exposing the peat to air and allowing decay. And then you've got physical abrasion from the weather, rainfall and wind, opening up these channels and creating huge erosion scars in the landscape, as well as vast areas of bare peat devoid of its natural vegetation. And in these channels, you know, they can be 6 feet deep. Walkers get stuck in them, livestock gets lost in them, grouse chicks get stuck in them. Landowners have realised that this erosion it's not sustainable. And downstream, the water companies, there are drinking water companies, have seen an increase in the brown water, which is just water with dissolved peat and peat particles in it, washing off the hills, and it's costing them to have to treat that water. We've also seen our flood defences being under greater pressure now with increased storms from climate change, but the defences, the flood defences, are being put under increasing stress because when it rains or there's a storm event, the water washes off the hills much faster on these bare eroding peatlands than it would do in a healthy environment where you would have sphagnum mosses to allow the water to percolate more slowly. In the lowland areas, in the fens, as I explained, the flooding is now occurring on these vast agricultural areas, and the soil is literally being blown away as the peat is tilled and worked and drained. This dry material is being lost at an alarming rate. So as climate change has become a priority for government, the scientific assessments of the relevance of peatlands for climate change has really proven some quite astounding, eye-opening facts. Over the thousands of years that peatland plants have sequestered carbon through photosynthesis and taken it out the atmosphere and then preserved it in the peat in the dead plants, we have a store of over 3 billion tonnes of carbon in the UK. More worryingly, with so many of our peatlands being in a degraded state and drying out, this carbon store is now emitting carbon at a rate of over 20 million tonnes of CO2 every year, which again is a huge part of our UK's greenhouse gas emissions. Economists have estimated that the cost of our damaged peatlands stretches into the billions of pounds as we lose valuable services like flood management, carbon storage, as well as the archaeological material and biodiversity. And on top of that, the drained, degraded peatlands are imposing an additional cost on society as carbon enters the atmosphere and contributes to climate change. And the longer we delay, the greater the peatlands deteriorate, and then the more costly they are to repair. About 30 years ago, we saw incredible pioneering work by nature conservation bodies that showed that peatlands can be re-wetted. By blocking ditches, reducing burning and grazing pressures, and removing the conifer plantations, there can be a rapid response from the peatland. Increased water levels mean an almost immediate reduction in the loss of carbon, and the recovering peatland vegetation forms a roughness that slows the peak flows of water after storms by up to 25%, and even some of our most threatened and difficult to manage bird species like dunlin and golden plover can return to breed within a few years after restoration. These are ancient systems and they won't return immediately to their full function and their full biodiversity, and you won't replace ever the archaeological resource, but enough can recover fast enough to demonstrate that peatland restoration is highly cost effective. So we have the technical ability to restore peatlands, we know how to re-wet them. The next problem is how to urgently scale up our efforts. Who pays, and how do we gain the support of those private land managers who have been encouraged in the past by society and governments to drain the peatlands? Inevitably, there are conflicts as land managers and developers seek to defend their activities. But we've seen successes where huge areas of peatland restoration, covering thousands of hectares in areas like the Flows, the Pennines, the Peak District and the Yorkshire Dales, Dartmoor, Exmoor, using partnerships of public bodies and conservation organisations, working with land managers and local communities, explaining the problems arising from the past land management and showing the benefits of peatland restoration, as well as offering financial support to cover the cost of repairing and re-wetting the peatlands. The problem for many farmers and land managers is what next after re-wetting? If the land can't make any income, what use is it to them? The solution is for society to recognise that those people who restore and look after peatlands, or those people who maintain sites that were never damaged, merit some sort of support, public payment for public goods. Instead of financial grants for sheep and trees on damaged peatlands as we did in the past, payments should reflect the carbon, the water and biodiversity benefits of a healthy recovering peatland. And we've now got new market forces coming into play. Land managers can sell the carbon credits from halting the release of carbon into the atmosphere by re-wetting. And one of the most exciting opportunities is, particularly in the agricultural fenlands, is the idea of wet farming, where crops are grown that don't require drainage of the peatlands. and using things like reeds for making compressed fibre panels for building work, food crops that rely on plants that enjoy living in wet environments, and even growing sphagnum and harvesting it for use in horticulture as a replacement for peat. So this new approach to our peatlands, where there's recognition of their values and that can be passed on to the land managers, is something that's now in the UK peatland strategy, and there are government targets, legal targets for the restoration and protection of peatlands, which all together is a package that is definitely a world-leading example. So with our peatlands, we've had this past damage, we've got a solution, and we're really working well to repair the damage from the past. I think one of the important things to appreciate is that that's not the whole story. The real beauty of our peatlands is in enjoying them. And we have a huge diversity of peatlands, both in terms of their ecology, but also cultural linkages across Britain and Ireland. Each peatland site has the scars of past activities, but we also have stories of people working to recover and restore the peatland, and an immensely rich peatland heritage around these. The blanket bogs of the Peak District, the Pennines, the Yorkshire Dales have fantastic histories of communities working and living in these areas, and it's all part of the experience of visiting the peatland. Long distance paths such as the Pennine Way across the backbone of England give you access to these incredible areas. The huge 400,000 hectare flow country in Caithness and Sutherland should be on everyone's bucket list to visit. The largest and best example of an Atlantic blanket bog in the world, and it was the centre of the controversy between forest planting and conservation in the 1980s, but now seeing recovery as the plantations are removed and the drains are blocked. And you have a wonderful nature reserve at the heart of the flow country at Forcenard that benefits from close proximity to one of Britain's most spectacular rail journeys that goes across the massive bog expanse to the station at Forcenard, right on the doorstep of the nature reserve. Many of our national parks hold blanket bog, including Snowdonia, the Berowins in Wales, Exmoor and Dartmoor, where there's the long history of tin mining and the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes' Grimpen Mire in The Hound of the Baskervilles. The Dartmoor and Exmoor mires also support the most southerly populations of dunlin, breeding dunlin in Europe. And then you've got your Irish blanket bogs, which on that Atlantic fringe, with up to 4 metres of rain a year, is such a moisture-laden environment. It's absolutely ideal for mosses, and you do get some wonderful blanket bogs out there. The lowland raised bogs, which once dominated central Ireland, now sadly occur as a few remnants, as well as sites across northwest England, Wales and central Scotland. Many of these have seen restoration work following peat extraction and drainage, and as part of their recovery, they've been given wonderful visitor access and interpretation facilities, following our ancestors, if you like, with the construction of wooden trackways and boardwalks, some of them incredibly impressive structures. They're designed to protect the bog and allow us access without damaging it. The fens, sadly, so much of them have been lost. What's left are incredibly precious, and although small, these are some of our most biologically diverse sites in the country. Wicken Fen in Cambridgeshire has over 9,000 species of plants and animals in this little island of fen in the great agricultural landscape of East Anglia. And as part of that area, there's a huge new project, the Great Fen Project, looking to return arable land to fen, but also to look at trialling wet farming as an economic activity, so that the natural habitat will have some buffering with higher water levels. Despite the legal commitments to protect our peatlands and the government enthusiasm for restoring peatlands, there is still some conflict. We are still seeing damage to peatlands, and ironically, it's driven in part by our efforts to tackle climate change. Wind farms, forestry are both being pitted against peatlands, with each sector arguing that theirs is the greater climate good. But it's a false dichotomy. We need all three climate solutions, and what we need is effective planning approaches to deliver the best outcome rather than compromising our carbon efforts overall by damaging peatlands. The horticulture industry has been under pressure to end peat use for decades, with overwhelming evidence of successful peat-free gardening. The fact that the industry supports the growth of plants which can be good for the climate and biodiversity does not absolve them of the shared responsibility to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. A sustainable horticulture industry that protects peatlands and brings the opportunity for new industries manufacturing peat-free products and reducing reliance on imported organic material has to be the way forward, and urgently. Advocates of continued burning on peatlands are defending the indefensible. The point is often missed that healthy, wet peatlands don't need burning. The Peatland Archive gives us a wonderful ecological timeline of preserved material that shows us what the living surface of the peatlands were like throughout the millennia. And there is clear evidence of repeated burning on peatlands being a relatively modern activity in recent centuries. And in each time you can see the layers of charcoal arising from burning, and following each of these events, there's a decline in sphagnum growth. Fire suppresses the natural ecology of the sphagnum mosses, and on damaged peatlands, drained peatlands, it exacerbates the degraded dry state, with the risk of catastrophic events where the peat store itself ignites. But we mustn't let these conflicts dictate the narrative. I've learned from my trips to Ireland of the incredible, rich cultural associations between people and peatlands, with contemporary poets such as Seamus Heaney. I've got his book on my shelf behind me, as well as art. And then if you go into the ancient writings in Ireland, all talking about their peatlands, often with great affection. Social research has shown recently that people living and working in peatland landscapes across the length and breadth of Britain appreciate the specialness of their environment and value it for that reason. The important thing for us all to remember is that peatlands are vital to every one of us. It's our heritage, but it's also our water, our climate change impacts, the biodiversity. These are all intimately linked to our well-being. As we come out of this pandemic isolation and lockdowns, peatlands offer us places to breathe again, to get out and reconnect with nature, with all the mental and physical health benefits that that brings. And a visit to a peatland offers a chance to see firsthand how nature helps us. So I'll leave it as that just now and encourage everybody to get out and visit a bog. Thank you.